So Cathi Morgan is a fabulous researcher, and she has been looking into her family tree here in England. And what she has discovered is actually, would sort of curl your hair, send chills up your back. And she has really been tracing the workings of the Illuminati, a mind control program that involves things like the Tavistock Institute, Rand Institute in California, and other think tanks, as well as MK Ultra, etc. So we're talking about mind control, we're talking about probably genetic engineering of bloodlines, etc. And she traces all of this in really meticulous research. So I want you to welcome Cathi Morgan.
Thank you. Thank you, Kerry. Okay, so that was a great introduction. It saves me some work there. Okay, so I've been looking into my own circumstances because with the advent of the internet and our access to information, I noticed quite a lot of red flags about my own upbringing, and I set to and made it my sort of life's work to find out what really went on, which was quite difficult, but everything I found supported my initial theory. Now, I'm going to actually start by discussing a documented survey that took place. It was run from initially 1926 to 1923 to 1926, and then 1929 till 1935. And I was quite shocked to see how they have published such depth of detail about it. Now, the chap who was running the experiment on the ground, the doctor, Innes Pierce, has written a paper in which he identifies that eugenicists up to that point had only been looking at genetic background, but not the environment. And when they inaugurated the Peckham experiment, they determined to explore the environmental factors of inheritance. So they opened a centre, it was like a leisure centre, and he, the doctor himself, in his own words, said the experiment was for research into the biology of sex in its subtler manifestations and into the sociobiology of the family group and its environmental associations. So basically, they were observing courtship in the centre, and he alludes to that they had already studied the entire environment of the embryo, and that for the purpose of the Peckham experiment, they're going to look into the love and courtship, which then set the stage for the new individuals. So they weren't just going to look at the infants, they were actually looking at the whole courtship process. Now, I'm certain that the people who are being scrutinised in this way did not know that this was occurring. They just thought it was a leisure facility run by the council, great prices, etc. So there was a medical aspect to this where people were given a medical overhaul, which of course they knew about, and lots of activities. And he concludes that it opens up, quote, possibilities for research into psychology proper, that is to say, of the healthy or so-called normal, and for a scientific approach to the education of the child from a biological standpoint. So this feeds into the development of our educational curriculum and now the national curriculum. So these studies inform policy. So the Peckham experiment, who was behind inaugurating it? On the left there we have the doctors, and on the right some better known figures. Here we have J. Arthur Rank, Julian Huxley and Lord Horder. So that's who I'm just going to have a look at. Lord Horder, very high level individual here. He was the physician to four monarchs, Edward VII, King George V, King George VI, and Queen Elizabeth II. And he was also the president of the British Eugenic Society. Julian Huxley was on the advisory board, of course, of the Darwin, Huxley and Galton Wedgwood families who intermarried. Brother of Aldous Huxley, who of course wrote Brave New World, which has become an incredible metaphor for our society today. So he was the founder of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, by which cultural changes were spread throughout the population, basically, and internationally. Things developed in the UK or in other countries could be spread throughout the United Nations countries. This type of research would then be applied, and people would be compared, populations would be compared in other countries. He was a zoologist, and he was also the person who first coined the term transhumanism. And he was a prolific author on zoology, science fiction, and eugenics. And I'd just like to add that his brother, Aldous Huxley, is intimately linked with the design of MK Ultra in the United States. J. Arthur Rank is the third chapter. Very interesting. He made several hundred films throughout the life of... Oh yes, I must just say that as well as being chairman of the Peckham experiment, he also made children's films for the Children Film Foundation, of which he made several hundred, which sought out and attended to the thoughts and feelings of the children who watched them. So it eventually became the Children's Film Foundation. Although he did make many films, he was right in there at the start when the British film industry was starting out. And in fact, he'd actually made his money. His family were mill owners running flour mills. So he had an enormous wealth. The first specialised films... Now, this really is akin to the Peckham experiment in that the children in his Saturday morning clubs were being monitored in a very precise way. You might remember, if you're from the UK, from Britain, as a child going to the Saturday morning cinema clubs. You do. And how does it feel to know that there were figures in the audience watching every reaction and tying it to the precise moments in the movie to better gauge the effect of television and movies on the children. So he realised he had access to 400,000 children. In May 1944, he formed the Gaumont British Company, a special department of children's entertainment films under Miss Mary Field. It worked with a team of 10 directed by Mary Field and with 2 permanent scriptwriters and a production manager. So observation was carried out in the cinemas, and her method consisted of photographing the children exactly at the moment when the chosen tests are flashed on the screen. In order to avoid disturbing them, infrared was used. So this is literally from the instructions from a UNESCO document to the observers. And they're told it's fairly easy to accustom oneself to writing in semi-darkness. You can use a pocket torch and put some gauze over it to avoid disturbing the children, and to take a seat and observe the 2 neighbours and the child in front. So it was that precise. And there's a sort of image of that period. Really, the cinemas were huge in those days, although they're all looking quite solemn, so I don't think they're watching a film there. But and he also worked on a film regarding nurseries. Now, nurseries and nursery nurse training has been linked to Tavistock Institute. So she says the important thing is to photograph them at the exact moment, because other parts of the document have code for taking notes of reactions such as glazed eyes and very sort of detailed physiological observations were being made, as well as the photographs. And Lady Allen of Hurtwood was elected as chair for an independent advisory body which reviewed each of the films. Now, Allen of Hurtwood was elected, and she supported what's known as the Q camps, or also called the Hawkspur camps, which more experiment, more observation with those are some of the people. And there we see, of course, Julian Huxley popping up again. So I'd just like to say that, Lady Ellen Hurtwood was associated with the Q camps, which was set up by the Institute for the Study of Delinquency and the Scientific Treatment of Delinquency, So here we have the start of the Tavistock Institute. We had the Psychopathic Clinic, which changed its name to the Institute for the Scientific Treatment of Delinquency, which was set up by the Portman Clinic, which is also known as the Tavistock Clinic. And these camps and observations were in there right at the beginning. The people associated with the Portman Clinic were, many of them were the same as the ones involved with the setting up of the actual institute, the Tavistock Institute. So we have H.G. Wells there, and Havelock Ellis, Ernest Jones, Eric Twittrist, Carl Jung, and some more here. Again, Menzies Lies, Tavistock Freud, his statues outside the Tavistock. So here we're actually talking about the birth of psychology, and we're talking mainstream medicine here, really. We're talking the establishment, and I've really come to feel that eugenics was the establishment. It went underground and still remains. Our establishment still has a eugenic a view of the masses and their right to make decisions on our behalf that we're not told about. So in setting up these these clinics, we also had the child guidance clinics set up by the same group of people, and two of the main movers setting up the child guidance clinic was a surrealist called Grace Palethorpe, and she was also a doctor, and she set up the Institute for Delinquency, and Cyril Burt was the other prime person. So eugenicists, again, Cyril Burt was a eugenicist, and as I say, it was the establishment. So where did they go? Well, they went underground. So in 1968, Sir Alan S. Parkes noted that in 1960 a proposal was accepted for the Eugenic Society to go underground, and they coined the term crypto-eugenics, and it should be pursued vigorously. So from the 1960s, they were still operating covertly. And of course, eugenics, because of its Nazi associations, that was another reason that they didn't want to be out there in the limelight anymore. Now, I haven't actually included it in this talk, but there's a link between Gregory Bateson, who was in MK Ultra, whose father was a eugenicist. He was called William Bateson, and he described the poor as vermin and suggested they ought to be exterminated. I have a quote from him. I haven't included it here, but I'm just saying that this link between MK Ultra and the British eugenics is there. William Bateson actually became very good friends with a chap called Erwin Bauer, who wrote the go-to text that the Nazis used in the concentration camp. Now, he used to write to Bauer, they used to correspond, and they initially made their first contact over discussing scopolamine, which is a drug that is known to be, if it's administered, you can get people to do things and they completely will not remember it. And it is still in use today, and it's also was used during childbirth at one time. So, of course, it's this attitude of the elite giving the impression that the masses are poor and unfit and so on. So by 1969, measures were made and to cover up Eugenics Society. So the name Eugenics was gone. Now, Lord Horder himself and Julian Huxley were members of a population investigation committee, which interestingly was funded by Unilever, who I've noticed that they fund the study I was part of. So I was part of the National Child Development Survey. I was born in 1958, so everyone born in a certain week of that year was signed up to this survey. It was just supposed to be questions as you go through your life. It's a longitudinal study. And a red flag, an alarm bell for myself was when I noticed in the documentation for this survey, it said children would only be contacted for the first time at the age of 6, whereas my parents said that we were visited at least every 3 months from birth by doctors. Now, this is how I came to look at this population investigation committee. And also, I'm interested to see that Unilever funded it, who'd also funded the Tavistock Institute. They funded the gifted children part of the study. So there's the prominent members. And James W.B. Douglas was the person who implemented the 3 studies, the National Child Development Studies. They were 12 years apart. They studied 3 generations, and one was in 1946, one was in 1958, and the other one was in 1970, I think it was 12 years later. Yeah, 1970. So James Douglas had worked with Julian Huxley and a chap called Solly Zuckerman on primate studies funded by the Eugenics Society. And the zoologists, all the zoological research was to be applied to humans. That's why they did it. Ornithology, zoology. It wasn't to know what the mating habits were. Well, it was to know what the habits were, but it was to be applied to better understand the human behaviour. Which they make quite clear. Now, Zuckerman was a high-level scientific advisor on operations research during the war, and he is linked alongside Henry Tizard to brainwashing discussions with the CIA. And he was also a self-styled population expert for which he had to consult Julian Huxley for help initially, because they had him in there. Now, these are the 3 that met under the auspices of the Ministry of Defence, the Defence Research Policy Committee, which there's lots of changes of names of these things along the lines. They keep constantly changing the names, so it's difficult to track. And Tizard was in Montreal having talks with the CIA in 1953, to which what came out of it was Ewan Cameron's work in Canada, because the talks were between America, England, and Canada. This is in 1953. But interestingly, in 1947, just 6 years earlier, they were looking at how to spread the British Empire throughout the world, and they bizarrely came up with a plan where they would export up to 15 million, between 3 and 50 million Brits would be exported out to Africa to try and export British culture. Now that plan was shelved, but the actual thought behind it wasn't. So he was the head of the SIS when it became MI6, so British intelligence. And this is work from a blog called MikeMcClary.wordpress.com, who's done some excellent work linking Tizard with William Sargent's work and Ewan Cameron. William Sargent being a chap who carried out exactly similar work to Ewan Cameron. And for those that don't know, Ewan Cameron was busted when mental patients were able to identify that they had been experimented on and it had been secretly funded by the CIA, but they got found out. And William Sargent was his counterpart in the UK. So this has now been evidence, which is quite exciting, because doing this kind of research is so much we can speculate, but to get the hard evidence is where the work has to be done. So Tizard, yeah. So that's the WordPress address blog there. If you wanted to look deeper into this sort of military cooperation between America, Canada, and the UK in respect of MK Ultra. Interestingly, Henry Tizard was the first person to insist that UFO sightings should not be dismissed, and a department should be set up, and it was named the Flying Saucer Working Party in 1950. So that's quite appropriate. Yeah. Now, interestingly too, his son, Peter Tizard, actually, he was a neonatologist who administered care to preterm babies, and he was a friend of my consultant when I went to Hammersmith Hospital to have my first baby. So it's kind of strange that I went into this hospital that was associated with these people. And of course, Tizard's colleague Solly Zuckerman had a major influence on the study I was part of. So my consultant, Hugh Jolly, was a friend of Peter Tizard. And this advisory council on scientific policy is an opportunity to introduce Lord Herbert Morrison, because as you see, Zuckerman is on there, and Henry Tizard, and Lord Herbert Morrison he married in I think it was 1950, and the woman he married was a family friend of my grandmother. So I always wonder when he keeps popping up on boards, if they said, oh, there's some twins been born, oh, how would you like to bring them into something, I don't know. I'm still trying to trace the exact thing that happened and how we got there, but he does keep popping up. And there's Erasmus Darwin Barlow there. Now, he's also popped up because... Oh yeah, so there we just have another incidence of Zuckerman and Morrison together as well, and Blackett there. So this is just reiterating what I said about Solly Zuckerman. However, before they did the 1958 surveys, as I have mentioned before, Zuckerman was involved in a study of children in Hull and Sheffield and Birmingham, where they interviewed children who'd been involved in the Blitz and been bombed, and they took that information to inform Lord Lindemann as to how to get the most effect out of the bombing campaign in Germany, and Dresden in particular. How the reason they bombed housing, working class housing, was because of the study done in Hull. More blood per bomb is the exact phrase that they used. So these are the, you can't put anything past them when they're willing to look at people and human beings in such a cold, psychopathic way. Okay, so my family, when I was aged 4, we moved down to Bath in Somerset. I was born near Manchester in Rochdale. And we were moved down to Bath, and strangely, we were just 10 miles away then from the team who were running the NCDS surveys. And Sir Edward Darwin Barlow, who was on that committee, he was on another committee that was meeting within about 4 miles from my house, which had top eugenicists on it. Barlow and Zuckerman actually became a president of that organisation later on. There's another Huxley sibling was involved with that organisation, and we were also within 4 miles of the secret deep underground base at Corsham, and at that time it was very secret. There was a register and only 500 people knew about it. It was like 1963 when we moved down there, no, 1962, and so all these sort of links were alarming me. So a big red flag was that my first partner, whose baby I went into that hospital for in Hammersmith, also got MK Ultra links in his background. So I went in to have my first baby, and his father was friends with a chap called Brian Inglis, who was the godfather of my partner's brother. And Brian Inglis was linked with Arthur Kessler, who attended the MK Ultra Macy conferences. He was so close to him that he actually started a foundation with him called Kessler, Inglis and Bloomfield. Bloomfield himself was a very interesting character, a member of a secret organisation called the 1001 Club, and he actually owned a hotel in the centre of London where Aleister Crowley actually lived at one time and corresponded with him. Inglis had lunch with Stephen Ward a few days before he died, another name from the Profumo affair that's been linked with MK Ultra and Monarch girls in the UK. When I ran away from home at the age of 15 and ran away to London, I got a live-in job in the Athenaeum Club in Pall Mall, which I have found many of these names of people, especially the Huxleys and the Darwins and so on, were members historically of this club. These eugenicists were linked to this club, so I suspect manipulation. Now, basically, that's it in a nutshell. So I hope you found that interesting. If you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them now.